Please.
Okay, hi everyone, thank you very much for being here, and thank you Paolo for having me here. I am so glad to introduce myself as a new hominger, and I'm going to talk about my previous research at the Global Development Institute, where I finished recently my PhD. My research looked at how people who have fled because of violence and human rights abuses experience ideas of home and the location of home following these kind of serious human rights abuses. And today I am just going to talk about one of my empirical chapters, and I have entitled this presentation for today, Looking at the Invisible, the Painful Memories of Losing Home Among Internally Displaced People in Colombia. Before going to the structure of my presentation, I want to share with you what are the rationale behind this title. And I have two ideas in mind that I really want to share with you. One is an interview I had during my fieldwork in 2014. I interviewed a woman who fled twice because of violence and human rights abuses. The first time she fled because she was victim of a murder attempt, and then she was raped. And when I asked her what are the meaning of being displaced and the connection between conflict, displacement, and home, she told me something like that I translate from Spanish to English. And I want to prefer to read for you. I have experienced several forms of violence. Displacement, however, is perhaps the most devastating one. After displacement, I experienced a sense of being completely mute, exposed, helpless, and vulnerable. It is hard to explain it. There are some things that you are able to see and describe in words, but the experience of displacement is largely inside you. Nobody can see how displacement has transformed your life. But if you ask me, displacement is like the experience of being dead when you are aware you are alive. Your social world is suddenly collapsed. It is like a long-lasting agony in which you lose everything: your place, your home, your way of life, your source of income, and part of your cultural attachment. Why I decided to start with this narrative? Because this woman put so clearly that nobody can see how displacement has transformed her life, and nobody can see how people lose the sense of home, the sense of identity, and their way of life. So I was thinking that perhaps at some point, the losing of a home become invisible for some of the people who have never experienced this kind of human rights abuses and violence. And the second key idea, I am completely sure you are familiar with this idea, comes from The Little Prince. And The Little Prince was talking with a beautiful friend, the fox, and says something, let me tell you a secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. And I am making the point that what is essential for people who fled because of violence and human rights abuses is the loss of a place called home. That is absolutely essential for understanding the human well-being of every human being, and the meaning of being human, and the meaning of being a displaced person. Saying that, I want to explain now the structure of my presentation. First of all, I want to address why it's important in theoretical terms to understand the relationship between conflict, displacement, and home. Then I will briefly explain my case study and the research methods, and I expect to devote most of the time of my presentation explaining the finding of this empirical chapter, the temporal and spatial relationship between conflict, displacement, and home. And at the end, I expect to raise some conclusions and policy implications. I expect to hear your thoughts, questions, comments, criticisms, all of them is welcome at the end of the presentation. Hopefully in English and Spanish, because I only said to say grazie in Italian at the moment. Next, why it's important to look at the relationship between conflict, displacement, and home. Most of the scholarly research on forced migration suggests that displaced people lost material assets, a physical shelter, a plot of land, and those kind of things. But what happened next? People just experienced this kind of issues, lost the house, the shelter, and they maybe recovered the house and the shelter, and everything is fine. What I am trying to suggest is that they lost something much more vital for understanding human well-being. What is that? They lost a sense of home, and they consistently struggled for years, decades, or even generations to remake a sense of home. Here I am drawing on the very inspiring research conducted by Anna Arendt when she was explaining what happened with the refugees during the Second World War and those people who were moved to the deportation camps. She said, of course, it's a kind of visible that they lose their shelters, their communities. But what is next? They lose a sense of home, and they experience a struggle to remain home, even after several decades. And I was reading carefully in Hannah Arendt what Hannah Arendt meant by home. What is the meaning of losing a place called home? She never addressed this issue, but she has just said that, and I found that so inspiring, and I wanted to look at this idea in a particular case. What is the difference? Hannah Arendt was thinking about people who move across national boundaries, and my case study is with people who move within national borders in Colombia. So at some point we need a discussion about this issue. And then, what I was just doing my literature review, and I expected to find too many papers about addressing the role of home for understanding conflict and displacement. And my surprise was that so difficult to find a single paper, for example, I read or tried to identify in the Journal of Refugee Studies, a very well-known journal addressing this kind of themes. And I found several, not to say dozens of articles exploring ideas of home for refugees, meaning for people who cross the borders. And I couldn't find by 2016 a single one addressing the issue of home for internally displaced people. And I say, that is so strange. We are taking for granted that refugees lost a sense of home because they crossed the borders. In this sense, we are just, as you said before, taking for granted that home could be the nation, the homeland, and at some point assuming that people who move within their own country just still at home, just in different places. So I am using here the very interesting argument made by Professor Lisa Malki, and Lisa Malki challenged research on migration, suggesting that we tend to use what she called the national order of things, to say that home is often understood in scholarly research on home and migration as the nation. My claim is that we can see that people who move because of violence and human rights abuses within their own country can experience the sense of being a foreigner in their own land. Well, displaced people, but you maybe still ask, okay, but why this is relevant? And I have, you know, when you are doing your PhD, you need to have a kind of justification for everything. Your supervisor say, but why, and why? And so I was so lucky, and I found David Thornton and Helen Taylor very inspiring piece of research. And David Thornton was conducting research for 30 years with the Murcia. I am sure that here I am some expert about this experience. And Taylor was conducting a very interesting piece of research called Greek and Turkish Cypriots who fled during the war in Cyprus and then to move to London. And they say, why is important to look at this idea of home? And they say something so simple but so clear to me. Home is so essential for understanding the very meaning of being displaced. If you overlook the idea of home, you rarely or maybe you struggle to understand what is the meaning of being displaced and how people experience displacement. So I hope you believe in this. As I said, I am drawing primarily on refugee studies because I couldn't find literature addressing the idea of home in displacement studies. So even though I found some literature addressing issues of shelter, house, and those kind of things, and they used to use the word house or family as a synonym of home. And I was trying to understand how they use this word. And I just understand that they use the word home as a house, that's a key issue, and in this case they used to see home as a material space, primarily. And second, they used to see that home for the people was the place left behind, and the solution for displacement was just return. And I am trying to problematize this idea, drawing on several scholars, in particular geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, and people who write for housing studies and cultural studies. And I am suggesting that instead of seeing home as a unidimensional space and a static one, we perhaps can understand home as a multidimensional, relational, and dynamic. Very briefly, what I mean by that. Multidimensional means that home is material and symbolic at the same time. As Paolo said in his recent book, and Professor Alison Bloom, for example, home is a set of material things that have material and non-material value, but home is also a set of ritual, symbolic things that really matter for people. People sometimes find a better shelter after displacement, but they don't feel at home at all. Why? Because the ritual, the symbolic, is also important for them and they can find it in the new place. The idea of relational is also simple. What is the meaning of relational home here? Home connects people with other people, within the domestic space, but also beyond the domestic space. In this regard, the idea of home is closely connected with ideas of family, intimacy, privacy, and these kind of things, but also with ideas of cultural identity and belonging. So when we look at home in this relational way, we are thinking also in the domestic, in the private, but also in the public, and connecting identity, belonging, and home. And finally, I am suggesting that home is a dynamic space. I often have very interesting discussion with that because many people say you can take for granted that home is dynamic. What I am trying to say is I acknowledge that some people who fled because of violence and human rights abuses expect to return because they only see home in the place left behind. But we can say that this is done history for everyone. And what I am calling dynamic home here means something different. People who move because of violence and human rights abuses are often aware that the place left behind and they themselves are completely different persons. Displacement is an experience, as the first woman said in the narrative, that changed your life. So you can just take for granted that the place left behind is waiting for you after 3 decades and you can find easily your home. So what I am suggesting is that home, meaning of dynamic space, is a space that we create in everyday life. What the Professor Laura Hammond called the everyday social day matters for understanding people's relation to home. My claim here is that violence and displacement disrupt this idea of home. But after that, following conflict and displacement, what happened? Some people perhaps are able to remain home on the move, but some people perhaps never regain the feeling of being at home. So these kind of questions need to be empirically explored. Today, I am just going to focus on the experience of losing home, but perhaps in the future, in another seminar, we can discuss to what extent some people can remain or not remain home. Well, what did I have just mentioned 100 times, home, home, and home. What is home for the displaced people I interview? Very briefly, home is about all multidimensional. It's a place, but this is not just the shelter. It's a way that people make a living and become or are independent in their everyday life. So when they lose the material home, they do not only lose the shelter, but the possibility to make a living by themselves, for example. Home is a social word because they lost very often the sense of family and the sense of community and see themselves detached from their cultural identity. Home also means to lose the familiar landscape, and in this case, in the context of Colombia, for example, is so important because they move primarily from rural areas, so they are accustomed to social natural landscape, and they are just trapped in buildings, and they say, this is not a landscape I am happy to be, just walls, walls, and walls. I really miss the mountain, the fresh air, the taste of food, the smell of home, and those kind of things. And you can imagine these kind of things, the river, for example. But they also miss the cultural practices of this particular landscape. And finally, home is so an existential and emotional space. Many people using different ways during the fieldwork say, I miss my home, I miss the way where you can find your soul. And people ask me, can you imagine living for 30 years without finding your soul? And I say, yes, what is the meaning of that? This is so profound. How do you manage to live in a place where you don't want to be, and then you feel in the sense of being in limbo for such a long period of time? Well, very briefly about research methods and context. I did my fieldwork in Colombia. Why Colombia? Because Colombia is, along with Syria, the country with the largest figure of internally displaced people in the world. And at the moment I conduct the fieldwork, Colombia was still in an ongoing conflict, 5-decade conflict. And when I finished my PhD by the end of 2016, the government reached a disagreement with the guerrillas. But I want to put emphasis on that. And my research was conducted when people were still feeling about the going back to the places left behind because they were still. So yeah, we need to be cautious about the implications of this after post-agreement. Well, when people in Colombia fled, people fled in Colombia because at some point they feel trapped by different circumstances of violence. For For example, combats between different armed groups, indiscriminate attacks, landmine contamination, and also mass killings, or people because they were targeted by crimes such as kidnapping, forced recruitment, torture, and rape, particularly for women. This picture, just to illustrate, they were taken by a Colombian photographer, Jesus Abad Colorado, and he's just displaying some of the critical moments of the history of violence in Colombia. Here in this photo, a church was destroyed and more than 100 people were killed in this particular episode. Here is just people on the move trying to carry with them the belongings. And here is just people waiting in an emergency in a hospital if their parents or families are alive or dead. Well, in terms of methods, I conduct 72 semi-structured interviews with people who fled since 1980 to 2010. I wanted to make some comparison between short-term displacement and long-term displacement. I also conducted focus group sections with host communities and displaced people in order to observe how they interact and how they, or to one extent, the displaced feel comfortable making a home in the host community, and to one extent the host community see them as part of the community or as outsiders. Participant observation also in the people's houses when possible, and in their neighborhoods. Life stories with those who were really prone to share their experience of violence, to try to identify the connection between different forms of violence and home. And finally, interviews with academics, policymakers, and humanitarian workers in order to understand the extent they see home as the place left behind, or they are working on helping the people to remain home in the new place. Well, moving to the findings, what about the temporal and spatial interplay between conflict, displacement, and home? As you can see in this picture, which is indeed a tapestry made by displaced women in Colombia, displacement is experienced as a moment of fundamental panic and confusion. When rebels or paramilitary groups arrive at people's places, they destroy everything. They kill people, they rape women, and they force other members of the community to leave. Anipa, I am showing the photos of the people using pseudonyms, but I have the authorization of these people to display the photos. And they asked me, I really want that when you talk about your research abroad, people see my face, because I am an ordinary human being who has faced several experiences of violence, and I don't want to be abstract. I want to see that people see my face. So she is Anipa. Anipa is a woman who fled because she was raped twice in a single week. The first time she was raped for a single man, but 2 days later, more than a dozen of people or men raped her because she is a lesbian. So they were trying to help her to understand what is the meaning of being a real woman. So she was raped several times in a single day, and every man said to her, now you have learned the lesson. What is the lesson she has to learn? How to be a woman. And just, I asked her, what is the meaning of being a displaced person? And she just shared this with me. After rape and displacement, I lost my home. Nowadays, I struggle to see myself as a human being. I lost part of my personal history. I struggle to live in the present, and I see future nowhere. Why I'm using this particular narrative? For several reasons. Anipa struggled to see herself as a human being. What is the meaning of that? We have learned from sociologists that every human being, disregard the condition, they still see themselves as a human beings, and we try to use this idea. But for some people, when they suffer these kinds of human rights abuses, they say, people just don't think I am a human being, and I really now struggling to see myself as a human being. And if but only, the most difficult situation after displacement is that I really struggling to see myself as a human being. So I have no place to call home, and other people don't see me as home in this particular place. But also, her narrative connects the importance of time, temporality in the understanding of home. She has loved the past, she struggled to live in the present, and she hopes in the future. So what is the meaning of that? She loves the past, the idea of home attached to the past. She has no home in the present, and what happened next? She has not real expectations about the idea of remaking a sense of home. Mateo, another of the participants of the research, told me that place was my world. It was my home.
There, I used to share everyday activities with my family and community. We lost our home, we lost everything that is essential for human life. That's it, like the Little Prince message at the very beginning. When you are displaced, he said, you experience the sense of being in a foreign land, in the wrong place. That is the very meaning, he said, of being a displaced person. I was asking people, or my concern was, why some people move as far they suffer human rights abuse, and why people some decide to stay in a place. And I found Maria Esperanza, a woman who stayed behind for 12 years before moving. And I asked her why. And because she explained me before that in her hometown it was destroyed twice by different armed groups. Many people in this particular place were raped, killed, forcibly disappeared. And I asked her why you decided to stay put for 12 years in this kind of context. And she just looked at me and said, that is a serious question. You probably don't understand anything. Yeah, and she said, it was our land, it was our home, and we love our way of life. That is the reason why I just stayed here for 12 years, just trying to be alive. But then, she wasn't sure I really understand, and so she told me this, and I prefer to read for you. The meaning of being displaced. To be displaced is like dying. You lose your home. How can I explain it? To understand my point, you need to imagine a fruitful tree. Suddenly, a bulldozer, driven by a man, takes the tree and pulls it out. With all the brutal force and power that this machine is able to emanate, the tree is ripped out. But this is not the end of the history. When the tree is suspended in the air, it is brutally shaken. The fruits fall down. Some die, but others are able to survive. Those who survive experience a new beginning, departing from nothing. So I found this a fascinating way to explain the meaning of being displaced and the meaning of losing a place called home. And I wanted to share that with you. Finally, I want to say some key ideas about the relationship between conflict, displacement, and home. It's not a single direction. My point is that consistently, those who fled because of violence and human rights abuses lose a sense of home. But there are some factors that shape this relationship. One is experience of violence. As I said in the case of Anilka, rape made a significant impact on women's life. Second, gender is an issue because rape in Colombia were particularly frequent in women. We really don't know much about what happened with rape in men, and it's an issue we should have more investigation in our context. Ethnicity also matters, and persecution. Very quickly, one example of ethnic belonging, because I have already mentioned some of the other examples. In Colombia, indigenous and Afro-Colombians tend to have a very strong attachment to the place left behind. So I wanted to show how they experience the loss of a sense of home. Most of the Afro-Colombians and indigenous I interviewed say, home for us is not an individual space, it's more a collective space. We call that space an ancestral land. And I interviewed Camilo, a man who fled just being 15 years old because he was at risk of being forcibly recruited. And he told me that black and indigenous in this part of the country have what he calls a symbiotic relationship with the place. And when children born, their parents just cut the umbilical cord, put in a piece of land, and then plant a tree. When children are growing up, they embrace the tree. So what the meaning of that? They are creating a very strong connection with the land. So if they move for any reason, he said, they want to go back there because something very special, their umbilical cord is waiting for them. So for them, home is necessarily, he said, the place left behind. And finally, Ruby, an amazing woman who had been doing a lot to contest for the rights of displaced people in Colombia, but for that had been displaced 5 times at the time I interviewed her. And I asked her, tell me about your experience of living without a place called home for such a long period of time. And she said, I only have nostalgia for the place left behind. I am just rambling from one place to another, and the only place I can see home is here in my memory. And for most of the people I interviewed in Colombia, home only still a longing or a place, a perfect or a beautiful place in their memories. Well, what are the conclusions and implications of this phase of research in the minute I have left? First of all, conflict and displacement consistently result in the loss of a place called home. Second, the relation between displacement, conflict, and home is diverse. Gender matter, experience of violence matter, ethnicity matter, and the years in condition of displacement as well. The loss of home is experienced not just as the loss of the physical shelter, but, and Anna Arendt says, the loss of one place in the world. That is so interesting to see how people who moved in the 80s and 90s in Colombia still feeling themselves as people out of place. Home is a multi-layered concept, multidimensional, relational, and dynamic. And finally, what I am trying to suggest is that home is a powerful analytical tool for understanding migrant life, but in more general terms to understand human life. So what I believe that the displaced refugees and asylum seekers need is not only shelter and food, and many maritime organizations take for granted. What they need is to remake what they have lost. They need to remake a sense of home. Thank you very much indeed.